Mahito is a curse who constantly evolves the more fights he's in, and we saw in Shibuya he reached a level that even Yuji Itadori couldn't reach, but was in the end outsmarted and presumed to be dead. But what if this never happened? What if Mahito somehow survived the encounter and escaped the scene, leading into his evolution being taken a step further, and he would eventually join the Culling Games? Today, me and Broken Ronin will not only be discussing how strong a post-Shibuya Mahito should be, but also discuss where he'd stack up compared to beats like Ryu and Kashimo in terms of capabilities.
But before we continue any further, I would like to give a shout out to today's sponsor.
Raid Shadow Legends, a completely free-to-play game with over millions of players and over 80 million downloads. In this game, you are resurrected by Teleria's immortal guardian, the Arbiter, to stop a shadow cast by the Dark Lord Suroth. Champions like Sir Nicholas, who with his first skill has a 50% chance to place a freeze debuff which cannot be resisted by enemies. His aura skill as well increases all allies' HP by 33%. Another built different champion is Tormund the Cold, who with his aura skill can increase the entire team's defense by 33%. And he excels especially in the arena as he has a 50% chance to place a freeze debuff that can't be resisted on any enemy that has a buff placed on them. These champions specifically you can get due to these being winter champions, and basically now that December's here, Raid is giving in-game content like these Icy Warriors. Raid as well specifically has a Christmas holiday themed campaign which you guys could then follow Sir Nicholas through a festive story. This mode comes with mini games which allows you to win not only in-game prizes but also real life ones. Once again, go and download Raid Shadow Legends please, the link will be down in the description, and thanks once again Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video.
As far as Mahito's capabilities before getting killed, he was said to be faster than both Yuji and Todo before his transformation while expanding his domain. But aside from Gojo and Naoya, pretty much he has the fastest domain cast out of any character in the series. And when he underwent his transformation, it's implied he tapped into the level that Jogo said he would eventually reach. Not only that, but it's pretty clear, had it not been for Todo's outside assistance, this Mahito would have torn Itadori to shreds. And that is also not considering the fact that this Mahito is stronger than the same one who was already tapping into 120% of his true potential. We'll get into more of Mahito's abilities later, as I'd like to see how they interact with the other participants. It's already been established that with each fight he grows exponentially, going from scrapping with the likes of Nanami and Yuji to now not even seeing them as threats individually. We also know through Black Flash, Yuji is able to essentially grow as the fight goes on, meaning this would probably apply to Mahito as well.
Yeah, Yuji is definitely someone who on his own adapts and adjusts to the conditions of a fight the best he can, but Mahito's ability to evolve has a lot more emphasis than Yuji's. With that into account, Mahito, if he were to survive and let's say escape Kenjaku's grasp after he tried to exorcise him, this leads into him wanting to not only stop his plans, but probably take him out. This is an easy way to just put him into the games, and it would also give him motivation to further evolve. Similar to what Itadori showcased, as even Yuji after the events of Shibuya and is still weakened, did show an increase of power, and in Choso's eyes was compared to that of a demigod. And if Choso compares Yuji to that of a demigod, then think of Mahito by this point being the closest thing to that of a divine being. And by this point, he should just be able to do what he did in Shibuya, but better, and obviously has a whole transformation amp on top of this. Unfortunately, Mahito wouldn't have any crazy new techniques, but he would have a refined domain expansion, along with still being capable of utilizing idle transfiguration, which with one touch from his hands results in your soul shape being changed and losing the fight from the get-go. Mahito as well can't technically be killed unless his soul is specifically affected, so it's going to be interesting to see how he stacks up against the other opponents. Which leads into the first matchup, that being in the Tokyo Colony 1, Reggie. Reggie just kind of gets one-tapped, I'm not gonna lie. At best, I think maybe he can just counter the domain with his simple domain, but I mean, Mahito doesn't need his domain to beat Reggie, bro. I'm not gonna lie.
So the best argument you can make in Reggie's case, right, is that he's sort of relative physically to someone like Megami. Megami kind of demonstrates some sort of relativity to early Shibuya Yuji, and if you want to argue that Yuji doesn't get stronger at all through Shibuya physically, which he does by the way, but let's say you want to be really generous to Reggie for some reason, he doesn't get any stronger, and that Yuji is relative to like a base Mahito. Not only does Mahito have a transformation that just makes him 200% stronger, as per Gege's own words, a transform Mahito is also so much significantly faster and stronger than what he was previously that the relative Yuji that he was fighting before would immediately be torn to shreds if he didn't land a key Black Flash immediately prior to the transformation. So even if you do assume that Reggie and Mahito are duking it out for some reason, not only would Mahito have the ability to just transform at a moment's notice and outstat him to a ridiculous degree, but obviously idle transfiguration and his ability to be unharmed by any of Reggie's physical attacks would allow him to just take it. No knives, no flower pots, no Mack trucks, no houses, none of that is really doing anything to Mahito. And even if you want to say for some reason Mahito's physical attacks aren't enough to take Reggie out relatively quickly, a couple of touches from his palms would certainly be enough to handle Reggie and anybody that follows him, like Hazanoki, for example, with relative ease. It's not really that difficult of a fight for Mahito, and this is a pretty straightforward one.
Yeah, I mean, there's really nothing Reggie can do here, and, you know, like we said, one touch and it's over. Next up, we have Higuruma, which, if he can affirm the allegations, then he could technically pull a W off, but I'm not gonna lie, me and Ronin were talking about this right before recording. We don't really know what's gonna happen to bro if Mahito just decides to domain clash with him.
Yeah, so like the thing we were talking about, right? Higuruma, under the assumption that he takes away Mahito's curse technique, definitely has a significantly better chance of dealing with him. Now, the reason I say that is because not only does taking away the curse technique eliminate a lot of Mahito's versatility and invulnerability to Higuruma's attacks, but as stated by the lawyer sorcerer, it also basically makes your cursed energy manipulation less refined, and for a curse spirit entirely made up of that very energy, if Mahito's cursed energy refinement is inferior to what it was before, it's hard to argue that he'd also be as physically capable as he's demonstrated himself to be in Shibuya, being relative to the likes of both Yuji and Todo in tandem. The problem is, right, that Mahito, unlike someone like Yuji, has the ability to open a domain in response to an enemy domain, right? Obviously, we see this multiple times in the series. Megumi does this with Dagon, Gojo against Jogo, etc., etc., etc. But the only problem is it's ambiguous as to whether or not opening a domain to clash with Higuruma's own domain expansion is an act of violence. If it is deemed an act of violence by the domain expansion or by Higuruma and Judgeman, then Mahito wouldn't be able to open it, and he basically should just lose in a very conventional sense. However, if that isn't viewed as an act of aggression or an act of violence, and Mahito is just allowed to clash domains and make sure that he's able to use his own technique, then I mean, he just wins, right? Higuruma's relative to Yuji without cursed energy. Mahito can fight a Yuji with cursed energy plus Todo and then some. So from there, it's pretty inarguable to say that Higuruma just physically beats up Mahito, especially with idle transfiguration keeping him invulnerable and very mobile.
Yeah, and surprisingly, out of all the opponents that Mahito is going to be facing, this guy might actually just have the best chance at a W, as you're going to see later on. But I think 9 times out of 10, it's probably going to result in Mahito's W. But, you know, if you guys just want to be generous to Higuruma, then you know what? Be my guest. Now, the next colony we have is the Sendai Colony, and starting off, we would have Kurushi. Now, Kurushi caught the likes of Yuta off guard, and Yuta did get damaged pretty significantly while they fought, but in the end, he still took on 2 other opponents that were way stronger than him. And in a best case scenario, I think Kurushi would actually get some pretty good damage off on Mahito, but the problem stems from that he can't really touch his soul. And with that, Mahito is just going to eventually come back and then catch Kurushi off guard, touch him with idle transfiguration, and GG's. And this is kind of the same way we looked at with Uro and Ishigori. Now, obviously, these guys scale way higher than Kuroshi as they were pressing the likes of Yuta, but with the likes of Uro's ability to reflect attacks and also Ishigori's overwhelming cursed energy, it's going to be a lot harder for Mahito to actually catch the W here. Though, like Kurushi, they still have the problem of not having a connection to the soul, and technically don't really have any domain expansion feats. Now, I already know this is going to come up, so I'll just answer the question right now. What would happen if Uro, Ryu, and Mahito got in a triple domain clash like how Yuta did? I mean, Mahito unironically has domain expansion feats, whereas these two don't. Their domain was off screen and it broke so fast that we couldn't even see what they were capable of.
Yeah, I mean, for a quick comparison, right? Ishigori and Uro don't even necessarily have like a pretty good feat of clashing with Yuta, because it's just stated rather explicitly by the narrator that the circumstances of all three clashing plus Kurushi made the barriers unstable from the jump, right? So even if you were going to argue that, okay, Yuta probably should be a really, really refined domain expansion user, and Ishigori and Kurushi were relative to that, the amount of time those barriers were even in contact is so minuscule and pretty irrelevant, it's just not really a feat for them, right? Whereas Mahito replicates one of the best domain feats in the entire series, which is like copying Gojo's point 2 domain expansion. And then he mentions that like post instant spirit body of disordered killing, he's become a significantly stronger curse that's like exponentially greater than the one he was before, right? So if being able to pop a point 2 domain was already not enough, the fact that he's just generally more skilled as a cursed spirit with cursed energy, it just makes that gap very difficult. Now, I'm not gonna say that he immediately overwhelms him with his domain in the same way that like Gojo did to Jogo, for example. It is to say that at the bare minimum, Mahito would be more likely than not the dominant domain user, or at least being able to clash with either Uro or Ishigori, or both of them at the same time rather equally without being at a massive disadvantage. One other important thing to note is that Mahito pretty much has one of the fastest domain recovery feats or times in the series. If you want to compare like every time he's had his domain broken, we basically see it's pretty consistent within the story that he recovers them quickly, whereas like Yuta and Uro don't recover their techniques for like at least several seconds up until like they're clashing with Ishigori. Yuta's jumping around and fighting and whatnot. Mahito explicitly recovers his technique within the span of like 0.1 seconds as Yuji immediately recognizes Sukuna slashing him and Mahito expands his body. Against Mekamaru, he's able to self-detonate immediately after having his domain broken and then reform and attack Mekamaru. And in Shibuya, after the point 2 domain expansion, all it takes is one punch from him and he's already immediately recovered his technique and is back in action. So even if their domains do shatter for some reason, say Kurushi re-enters the fold, he's likely going to have his technique back the quickest, and he's going to certainly be taking advantage of that.
And I think another thing to note as well is that this Mahito is a hypothetical one that survived Shibuya. So this guy is pretty much getting the same imp that Yuji got, which was already pretty like significantly to his physicals. So imagine a transformed Mahito interacting with the likes of Ryu. Honestly, he's probably gonna have a much easier time than the likes of Yuta and Rika, due to them mainly like not really having the strongest physical feats. Now, granted, they are still beasts, don't get me wrong, but this Mahito by this point should probably scale above that.
And even if you don't think that he does, right, this fight just turns into something very similar to Mekamaru versus Mahito, which we've actually seen, except Ishigori doesn't have the ability to, at a moment's notice, attack Mahito's soul. The reason I say that is because Ishigori certainly has higher cursed energy output than Mahito, but that doesn't really mean much because Granite Blast would just burn him temporarily, Mahito would heal using auto transfiguration and keep on fighting. And if you were going to argue that Ishigori would just burn him out of cursed energy, I simply would ask you, can you demonstrate that he can actually outlast a cursed spirit with this much energy, right? If you're looking for a couple of feats or statements, I mean, you have grade ones like Naobito and Nanami looking at Dagon as having this near immeasurable or inexhaustible well of cursed energy. Jogo then comes in is on another level than that, and Mahito is propped up as being the strongest disaster curse once he reaches his full potential. So I mean, even in the most basic sense, right, Mahito should have this level of cursed energy that's absolutely ridiculous. And while Ishigori certainly probably has good reserves, what he mainly focuses in is output, right? And Yuta is more of the character that focuses on reserves. Mahito is also able to spam his technique in the course of one night thousands of times, right? Making 1,000 transfigured humans that Gojo later defeats using his point 2 domain expansion. Mahito is spamming his technique to reform his body when fighting against Yuji, Todo, Nobara, and even transfiguring Nanami. There are hundreds of transfigured humans outside of B5F that Gojo never even touches, etc., etc., etc. And a common through line that you're going to see here is that no character in the Culling Games specifically, or at least in the Culling Games that we're going to be mentioning and putting Mahito up against, has feats on that level, has statements on that level to argue that they would be able to destroy him 1,000+ times and force him to spam his curse technique so much so that he runs out of energy.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of just pure like output, Ryu can definitely put Mahito down. That's not what we're saying, but you can't kill him. He has no connection to the soul. Like, it's just, you know, raps.
Yeah, and then Mahito just placing a palm on him, right, it'll just make it so that, oh, all of that durability that Ishikori has on standby doesn't really matter because your soul is going to be warped, and that's obviously going to be a major problem.
Now, that would conclude the Sendai Colony, and next up we would have him go up against Kashimo in Tokyo Colony 2.
So you're going to notice a pretty consistent thing here, but in the very similar way that, like, you say someone like Ishigori or maybe even Uro potentially like outstat Mahito, Kashimo was going to be in a very similar boat where if Mahito, you know, could be damaged by basic physical attacks, Kashimo probably does put the mitts on him, right? He has some pretty good hand-to-hand feats, scaling, and then that lightning bolt is probably more than fast enough to tag Mahito numerous times, just like it was able to with Hikari, but you run into the same issue. Kashimo has no feats of damaging the soul. Even if you say he brings out his curse technique, that doesn't really have arguments to being able to damage the soul. The best thing you could say is that, like, one of his like electromagnetic blast would like vaporize Mahito instantly, which is technically one of the ways to defeat him. But that gets into a little bit of like headcanon like territory, simply because we haven't really seen how that takes effect on a character if it immediately blows them up, like their entire body and whatnot. And if it doesn't, if any part of Mahito is left standing, he can just easily reform the rest of his body via his soul. So like, while base Kashimo and especially his curse technique form utterly dominate Mahito up close, the problem is simply that, like, doesn't really matter again. He's just going to be getting beat up. Mahito's gonna be like, cool, that's fine. I'll either like wait until you run out of cursed energy, which is probably a very viable strategy against someone like Kashimo who isn't established to have like this overwhelmingly massive well of reserves. If he's too impatient to do that, opening a domain expansion at point 2, or just opening it very quickly in general, probably would be enough to overpower or at least clash with his hollow wicker basket. We do know that like Hikari can open a domain faster than Mahito, and Hikari was able to sort of like blitz him with his own domain expansion. Maybe Mahito could do the same thing, although it's pretty ambiguous whether or not he would be able to. If not, all it means is that like his domain is being stalled out, and then they would just continue fighting as they would normally, which doesn't really mean anything. All that means is that Mahito just has to last longer than Kashimo, which, as I already established, all of his feats earlier kind of do lead to that idea. I mean, if you're not hitting the soul, right, you're not completely obliterating him off the face of the earth in one full shot, or you have enough cursed energy to outlast him, I mean, you're probably just not going to get past Mahito, which is something that, as we'll notice with the final antagonist of the Culling Games, Cursed Spirit Naoya in the Sakurajima Colony. So when it comes to Naoya, this is probably like the biggest gap in speed that Mahito's ever going to experience, at least during this little gauntlet run. Naoya is relative to, or even faster than a, you know, like middling awakened Maki. That Maki is faster than human Naoya. Human Naoya, while holding back, is faster than post Shibuya Yuji. So like Cursed Spirit Naoya is just several layers into being faster than Mahito, to the point where if he builds up speed, he's probably just going to blitz him outright. The only problem is that, once again, Naoya doesn't have any abilities that are able to one-shot Mahito. He doesn't have any abilities that are able to damage the soul. And we even see when he's not taking things as seriously, he's able to be sort of like tagged or caught off guard by like characters that are relatively slow. At least when talking about characters on Mahito's level, like Kamo. Kamo is able to kind of go back and forth with him a few times, specifically because Naoya isn't building up his speed and getting ready to charge him. So if he were to do the same thing with Mahito and not take him as seriously initially, which is pretty in character for Naoya, all things considered, it's the reason he loses to Shoso. It's just like a pretty consistent thing with his narrative. Then Mahito's probably just going to transfigure him with a couple of touches. Domain expansion to domain expansion, Mahito has better refinement feats. He's able to open a point 2, whereas Naoya has only opened a domain expansion one time and has never met any resistance or evolution with it. So on just about every front that I can possibly think of, Naoya would lose and just be like out-haxed, you know, outspeed Mahito for sure, but not really have the advantage anything else. Like even durability wise, Kamo mentions that Naoya isn't all that strong, being like weaker than that of Hanami. Hanami is able to be damaged by like Goodwill Arc, base Yuji and Todo, and Shibuya Mahito is already like stronger than those levels of characters. I'm gonna be completely honest.
Yeah, I mean, if Noritoshi Kamo is saying that Naoya is not all that durable, and the best thing he does is like chicken nugget chip damage to Hanami, it just doesn't look good for bro. Best case scenario, he just beams around the room for a bit, you know, just overwhelms Mahito for a good bit of the fight. He gets a little cocky, Mahito evolves and just touches him once and it's over.
Yeah, I mean, very simply put. Very simply put. I think honestly, the most danger that Mahito would be in during the Culling Games is going up against someone like Higuruma, specifically because if Higuruma's technique worked in a particularly beneficial way for him, Mahito's going to be fighting out here with no idle transfiguration, and that is when he's going to be the most vulnerable and most like exorcisable, to be completely honest with you.
Yeah, and for the record, if anyone was just wondering, oh, what if he fought Megumi and Yuji in the Culling Games? What if he fought Hikari, Yuta, and Maki? As a little bonus round, we could just run through that real quick. Megumi loses. Yuji probably still loses. I mean, I don't think we disagree on that, right?
Not at all. Yeah, I think Yuji, like, by himself just gets beat until like his major power up, of course, right? Which, by the way, is still kind of ambiguous. We don't even know where he truly scales, but I'm willing to say that he, like, immediately after powering up, he's stronger than Mahito. But anytime before that where he's relative to his Shibuya self, Mahito just cooks him, right? He almost cooked him with Todo and Nobara helping, right? So you remove those characters and Yuji's just getting like dominated. I mean, Gege literally says verbatim, if Yuji did not land that Black Flash, which he was only able to do due to Todo, he would have been torn to shreds, and this Mahito would just literally reenact that. And very similar sort of logic applies for characters like Megumi as well.
Yeah, and as for the stronger characters like Yuta, Maki, and Hikari, I mean, Yuta might have an argument for him being able to see the soul. I know a lot of people argue that. Maki has the same blade, or like a replica of Toji's blade that's like splits the soul. So I mean, there you go.
I'm gonna be completely honest with you. Maki pulls up to Mahito and just cuts his ass in half, soul and all. Yeah, Yuta probably has a pretty decent chance of taking Mahito down. Just because, like, if any character is going to have the cursed energy reserves to outlast Mahito, it's going to be the person that has more cursed energy than Gojo and is seemingly second only to Sukuna in terms of cursed energy amount, right? Rika's still seemed as like the queen of curses, specifically because of the raw amount of cursed energy that she possesses. If push comes to shove, Yuta can also just copy idle transfiguration and then really start going soul blow for soul blow if he really wanted to.
Oh my god, I wasn't even thinking of that.
I think the only heavy hitter that probably doesn't beat out Mahito is Hikari. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's just like basic Hikari doesn't have great enough feats to put him on Mahito's level. In terms of domain expansion refinement, I mean, he should be at best equal to Mahito, and then they're just fighting. So it's like no jackpot Hikari versus Mahito with all of his tricks. And then that kind of finishes it. But Maki and Yuta, I would argue 9 times out of 10, I'm gonna be real, probably 10 times out of 10, they're cooking up Mahito for sure.
How do you think Jackpot Hikari would stack up against him? Like, let's say he got super lucky against Mahito.
So it's one of those things where it's like, cool, you got that, right? You're hitting him and whatnot, and he'd be physically outstatting him, but it doesn't hit the soul. And here's the interesting thing, right? If Mahito does land idle transfiguration one time, that will not be healing. Hikari reverse curse technique cannot heal the effects of idle transfiguration, just canonically. Mahito states as much. If Hikari gets hit with that, like, even one of the biggest benefits of Jackpot, which is like the constant healing effect, would just be bypassed and ignored by Mahito touching him with his palms. Even then, it's kind of like a problem. And lasting 4 minutes and 11 seconds, like for those 4 minutes and 11 seconds, I'm completely fine with conceding that Mahito would probably just be getting his ass beat, right? As soon as Hikari has to, you know, oh, my cursed energy reserves are back down, I have to open another domain expansion, that's where Mahito kind of has his time to shine. Either pop his own domain or just attack like the vulnerable base Hikari. That's sort of why I think he has a little bit more trouble than like a Yuta or a Maki. Maki can literally blitz and one-shot him because she has a soul split katana. Yuta can develop idle transfiguration if he wanted to throughout the fight. He has enough cursed energy in his normal form to just like straight up compare to Mahito's reserves. Depending on your argumentation, might be enough to dispel Mahito, although it's rather ambiguous. And then he also has someone in Rika who is like strong enough to completely restrain the movements of Yuji. So even if he did want to sort of like immobilize Mahito temporarily, he would be able to do something like that. So I mean, Yuta and Maki just have a lot more options. Jackpot Hikari, like I said, in that form probably cooks Mahito up, but as soon as he needs to recharge, it sort of becomes a problem.
And that concludes if Mahito was in the Culling Games. He actually gets pretty far if you're not including the other protagonists, which was just mainly a bonus round because we're putting Mahito in place of the protagonist here. And he might actually just straight up solo the Culling Games. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. Do you think Higuruma would just beat him? Do you think other characters could maybe overwhelm him? Let us know down below. And also go ahead and check out Broken Ronin's channel if you haven't. which will be linked in the description.
Appreciate you having me, man. This was a really fun topic. Mahito is one of my favorite characters, so seeing how he would do against characters in the Culling Games is always really fun.
Yeah, and if you guys want us to do more JJK related collabs or just collabs in general, let us know down below what you'd like to see us cover next, and I'll see you guys in the next one. If you're still here, well, then I actually have a surprise for you. The next upcoming versus battle I'm going to be doing is Goku versus Superman with a fellow friend of mine, and as well I'm going to be incorporating animation, specifically stop motion. I'm really excited for you guys to see this, so I'm just going to show a little bit on screen before the video ends, and if you guys are excited or are anticipating this video, let me know down in the comments, as this will more than likely come out either during or a little bit after Christmas. I need to get the scheduling down. Thanks for those who stuck to the end, and peace out, guys.